The thermal perimeter sensors did not lie, but they often whispered in riddles. Elias Vance sat at his scarred workbench, watching the amber flicker of the holographic display. Something had breached the secondary containment field of the subterranean cache. On Boreas-Seven, where the mercury plummeted to minus 60 degrees Celsius before the twin suns even thought about rising, a breach was not just a theft, it was an act of war. The air in the cabin tasted of recycled oxygen in the sharp metallic tang of an overworked air scrubber. Elias stood, his knees popping like dry kindling. He was 42 years old, but in the crushing gravity and biting frost of this forsaken mining moon, his body felt as though it had endured a century. He pulled on his pressurized parka, the synthetic fur lining crackling with static. "Diagnostics," he muttered. A dry, synthesized voice replied from the wall. "Thermal cache 3 bypassed. Biometric seal intact. Physical structural integrity compromised. Probable cause, high-frequency vibration or localized kinetic impact." "Rats don't have vibratory cutters," Elias grumbled. He grabbed his pulse rifle, a relic from his days as an atmospheric engineer for the United Colonies, and stepped into the airlock. The hiss of equalization was a familiar, lonely sound. When the outer door slid open, the cold hit him like a physical blow, a solid wall of crystalline air that threatened to flash freeze his lungs. He moved with the practiced ease of a man who had spent 3 years calculating the cost of every footstep. His cabin sat nestled in a jagged caldera, protected from the worst of the ion winds, but the cache was 50 meters up the northern slope. When he reached the site, he found the heavy lead-shielded lid of the cache pried open. Not sliced, but torn, the reinforced hinges, rated for 2,000 kilograms of pressure, were twisted like soft tin. Elias knelt in the frost-cracked grit. The thief had been surgical in their selection. 3 canisters of concentrated nutrient paste, a dozen emergency thermal cells, and 2 kilograms of dried protein strips. But it was the arrangement of what remained that stopped his breath. The thief had emptied a crate of medical canisters to get to the food, but they hadn't scattered them. The small titanium tubes were lined up in a perfect descending row beside the open pit, tallest to shortest. "Coyotes don't organize by height," Elias whispered to the void. His breath materialized in a thick cloud, instantly turning to ice crystals that rattled against his visor. He followed the tracks. They weren't boots, nor were they the padded paws of local fauna. They were narrow, elongated indentations in the permafrost, the toes splayed and tipped with what looked like serrated claws. Vanguard tracks. Elias felt a coldness in his chest that had nothing to do with the environment. The United Colonies had officially decommissioned the Vanguard project 20 years ago. The bioengineered miners, built for high-gravity labor and extreme endurance, were supposed to be extinct, either worked to death or liquidated during the Great Purge. The fact that one was here, on Boreas-Seven, was a death sentence for anyone nearby. If a Vanguard was here, the hunters wouldn't be far behind. The trail led north, winding through a forest of crystallized silicate trees that sang with a haunting, high-pitched chime as the wind brushed their brittle branches. He found the thief in a shallow crevice beneath a granite overhang, barely 3 kilometers from his doorstep. Inside the hollow, curled into a ball no larger than a cargo crate, was a child. He looked perhaps 6 years old by human standards. Though Vanguard growth cycles were notoriously erratic, his skin was the color of slate, smeared with industrial grease and ash. He wore nothing but a tattered biomesh suit that had long since lost its heating elements. His ribs were visible, each breath a rattling struggle against the thin atmosphere. Elias raised his rifle, the targeting reticle glowing red in his HUD. The child's eyes snapped open. They weren't human. One was a deep, liquid gold. The other was a shattered mess of glass and flickering fiber optics, a cybernetic implant that had been partially torn from the socket. The growl that tore from the boy's throat was a sound of grinding metal and raw desperation. "Easy, kid," Elias said, his voice sounding thin through the external speakers. "I'm not a scrapper. I'm just the guy whose dinner you're eating." The boy lunged. He was a blur of gray limbs and desperate strength. Elias tried to pivot, but the child was faster than the moon's gravity should allow. Small, sharp teeth sank through the pressurized fabric of Elias's sleeve, finding the flesh of his forearm. Elias hissed in pain, swinging the butt of his rifle to create distance. The boy scrambled back into the darkness of the crevice, his small fist raised, his remaining good eye glowing with a feral intensity. "Fine," Elias said, gripping his bleeding arm. "We're doing it the hard way. You've got a hell of a grip for a starving scrapper." He didn't fire. He didn't even keep the rifle aimed. Instead, Elias sat down on the frozen ground, 5 meters from the cave entrance. The wind howled across the ridge, threatening to tear the warmth from his bones, but he remained still. "You took my protein strips," Elias said conversationally. "The smoked ones. Those cost me 50 marks a crate in the last trade cycle. And you stacked the medical tubes. That was polite. Weird, but polite." The child said nothing. He watched Elias with the unblinking focus of a predator. "I'm going to leave something here," Elias continued. He reached into his utility belt and pulled out a fresh packet of self-heating broth. He clicked the activator and set the steaming pouch on a flat rock halfway between them. "No trap, just calories. If I wanted you dead, I would have used the rifle 3 minutes ago." Elias backed away slowly, retreating 20 paces until he was nearly hidden by the silicate trees. The child waited for 10 heartbeats. Then a small gray hand darted forward, snatched the pouch, and vanished back into the dark. Elias walked back to his cabin, the blood from the bite wound cooling against his skin. For the first time in 3 years, the silence of Boreas-Seven felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The second day was colder. The atmospheric generators in the distant valley must have tripped a fuse, because the sky turned a bruised purple, and the air grew so thin it felt like breathing through a straw. Elias Vance woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of the cabin's structural supports groaning under the thermal contraction. He followed the same ritual he had performed for over 1,000 days. Check the oxygen levels. Recalibrate the moisture evaporators. Drink a cup of bitter, synthetic coffee while staring out the only window at a horizon that never changed. He had built this cabin for one person and one purpose: to be forgotten. He had told the occasional supply smuggler that he didn't need companionship. He didn't need a second cot. He didn't need news from the inner colonies. "Diagnostics," Elias said. "Status of the bite wound. Minor tissue damage," the computer replied. "Infection risk, low. The saliva of Vanguard Model Scrapper 4 contains traces of industrial enzymes. I have administered a localized antiseptic." Elias looked at his forearm. The bruise was the shape of a small mouth. He packed a bag with more nutrient paste, a roll of thermal bandages, and a small solar-powered heater. He found the boy exactly where he had left him. The crevice was empty of the broth pouch, but on the flat rock sat the empty container, folded into a neat, perfect square. "You're a tidy little thief," Elias murmured. He set down the heater and the food. The child didn't hide this time. He sat at the very edge of the shadows, his golden eye tracking Elias's every movement. The cybernetic eye was worse today. A slow leak of coolant was dripping down the boy's cheek like a neon blue tear. "That looks like it hurts," Elias said, pointing to his own eye. The boy flinched, but he didn't retreat. "Trap," the child whispered. His voice was a rasp of static and broken vocal cords. Elias froze. "What?" "Trap," the boy repeated, his small hands trembling. "Men. Leave food. Then take." "I'm not taking anything," Elias said, his voice softening. "I've got more food than I can eat, and this mountain is too big for one person. It's not a trap, kid." "All on his trap," the boy said. He pointed to the horizon, toward the distant lights of the Ethelgard settlement. "They take. They burn." Elias felt a sharp pang of recognition. He remembered the night Ethelgard burned. He remembered the faces of his neighbors as they stood with torches, demanding he hand over the Vanguard family he had hidden in his workshop. They had called him a traitor to the species. They had called the Vanguard manufactured meat. "I know," Elias said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I remember the fire too, but I'm not them." He pushed the heater closer. The boy stared at the device, then at Elias. A flicker of something that wasn't fear crossed his slate-gray face. It was calculation. The cold, logical arithmetic of a being designed to survive. The boy reached out. His fingers touched the warm casing of the heater. He let out a small, shuddering breath and pulled the device into the crevice. "My name is Elias," the man said. The boy didn't respond. He huddled over the heater, his golden eye closing as the warmth began to seep into his frozen joints. "I'm going to call you Eon," Elias said. "Since you won't tell me your real one, it means a long time, which is how long it's been since I've talked to anyone who wasn't a computer." "Eon," the boy whispered, testing the weight of the word. "Stupid name." "You're welcome to correct me anytime," Elias replied with a ghost of a smile. On the third day, the boy was waiting for him outside the crevice. He had wrapped the thermal bandages around his waist like a sash. He followed Elias back to the cabin, staying exactly 15 paces behind. If Elias stopped, Eon stopped. If Elias turned, Eon crouched in the snow, blending into the gray landscape like a ghost. When they reached the cabin, Elias left the airlock door open. He went inside, sat at his workbench, and began to disassemble a faulty power cell. He didn't look back. He didn't call out. He simply left the invitation hanging in the air. An hour passed. The cabin was warm, the smell of simmering lentil stew filling the small space. Finally, the internal sensors chimed. A small gray figure had stepped into the airlock. Eon didn't come all the way in. He sat on the floor of the airlock, his back against the pressurized door, watching Elias with the same intense focus he had used on the silicate trees. Elias set a bowl of stew on the floor, halfway between the workbench and the airlock. "Eat," Elias said. "I'll be over here." He watched the boy out of the corner of his eye. Eon approached the bowl like it might explode. He picked up the spoon, studied it for a moment, and then began to eat with a ferocity that was painful to watch. When the bowl was empty, Eon didn't drop it. He walked to the small sink, stood on his tiptoes, and placed the bowl inside. Then he returned to his spot in the airlock. That night, Elias slept on his cot, and Eon slept on the floor of the airlock, wrapped in a spare heating blanket. The fourth morning brought the change Elias had been dreading. The dawn was not gray, but a violent red. The wind had died down to a whisper, but the cabin's long-range sensors were screaming. Elias sat up, his hand immediately flying to the pulse rifle leaning against the wall. "Report," he barked. "3 high-mass signatures approaching from the eastern ridge," the computer said. "Biometric profiles, Vanguard, velocity, 12 kilometers per hour. They are not hiding." Elias looked at Eon. The boy was already on his feet, his golden eye wide, his small body vibrating with a frequency Elias couldn't name. "Mama," the boy whispered. The airlock door hadn't even finished cycling when the first one hit it. The heavy Durasteel panel shuddered under a blow that would have crumpled a rover. "Vance!" A voice screamed from outside, a woman's voice, raw with fury and exhaustion. "If you've touched him, I will tear the air from your lungs." Elias barely had time to stand before the door exploded inward. The safety latches sheared off like toothpicks. A woman stood in the ruins of the doorway. She was tall, her skin a darker slate than Eon's, her hair braided with copper wire. She held a jagged vibro blade in one hand and a heavy-duty mining laser in the other. Behind her stood 2 more figures, an older blind Vanguard woman leaning on a staff of reinforced carbon fiber, and a younger girl whose cybernetic arm was sparking with blue electrical discharge. "Mama!" Eon cried, launching himself across the room. The woman caught him, her eyes never leaving Elias. She pinned the boy to her hip with one arm and leveled the mining laser at Elias's chest. "You!" she spat. Her voice was like grinding stones. "Tell me why I shouldn't turn this cabin into a tomb." Elias raised his hands, the pulse rifle lying on the cot behind him. He looked at the woman, then at the child clinging to her neck, then at the broken door that had kept him safe for 3 years. "Because the stew is still warm," Elias said, his voice surprisingly steady, "and because your sister's arm is about to short-circuit her heart." The silence that followed was heavier than the frost. The woman's finger tightened on the trigger, her black eyes searching Elias's face for a lie. "He fed me," Eon whispered into her ear. "He gave me the heat trap." The woman, Kira, lowered the laser by a fraction of an inch. She looked around the small cabin, at the single chair, the neat rows of tools, and the empty bowl in the sink. "Humans don't feed us," she said, her voice trembling with a decade of accumulated hatred. "They hunt us." I'm not a human today, Elias said, pointing to the empty chair. I'm just an engineer with a lot of extra calories and a broken door. Sit down before the ion storm hits, or we're all going to be manufactured meat by noon. The older woman, Hestia, stepped forward, her blind eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind Elias's head. She tilted her head, her nostrils flaring. The air here, Hestia said, her voice like wind over a desert. It smells of ancient guilt and fresh bread. He is the one, Kira. The one who said no at the gate. Kira's gaze sharpened. Ethelgard? Elias didn't answer. He turned to the workbench and grabbed a set of precision screwdrivers. He looked at the young girl, Jax, who was leaning against the shattered door frame, her face gray with pain. Bring her here, Elias commanded. The arm first, the politics later. The circle had closed. The hermit was no longer alone, and the trap of compassion had finally sprung, catching 5 souls in a bond that Boreas-Seven would never be able to freeze. The silence that followed the intrusion was not the empty silence Elias had cultivated over the last 3 years. This was a heavy pressurized thing, like the air inside a failing decompression chamber. He stood in the center of his cabin, the wreckage of his front door scattered across the floorboards like the bones of a scavenged beast. Kira remained crouched, a coiled spring of muscle and scarred biomesh. Her mining laser aimed directly at the soft spot just beneath Elias's sternum. Eon was a small gray shadow pressed against her side, his golden eye flickering with a rapid, rhythmic pulse that signaled extreme autonomic stress. Elias did not look at the weapon. Instead, he looked at the markings on Kira's neck, a series of faded, barcoded tattoos that identified her as property of the Synaptic Union, a corporation that had gone bankrupt 10 years before Eon was even a spark in a gestation tube. Those marks were a ghost story. They were the same marks he had seen on a woman standing on the trade road outside Ethelgard 22 years ago. The memory hit him with the force of an ion gust. It was the smell that did it, the scent of ozone and wet slate that always clung to Vanguard's skin. Suddenly, the frozen walls of his cabin dissolved, replaced by the amber glow of a summer evening in the riftward territories. Ethelgard had been a prosperous place then. They had 3 atmospheric stabilizers that worked perfectly, turning the harsh desert air into something sweet and breathable. Elias had been 20 years old, a junior engineer with grease under his fingernails and a future that felt as solid as the stone foundations of the town hall. He remembered the woman on the road. She had 2 children with her, their skin a dusty gray, their eyes wide with the hollow stare of the chronically starved. They weren't asking for much, just a night in the stables and a few liters of recycled water. The mayor, a man named Sterling, who wore silk shirts even in the heat of the forge, had stood on the porch of the meeting hall. He hadn't looked at the woman. He had looked at the crowd of 200 settlers. They don't belong here, Sterling had said, his voice smooth and cold as a polished blade. They aren't citizens, they're equipment. You don't invite a broken tractor into your kitchen. If we let one in, 10 more will follow. Then 100. They'll drain our stabilizers. They'll eat our winter grain. Elias had stood at the back of the crowd, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the woman's children. They were holding hands, their fingers interlaced so tightly their knuckles were white. It's one night, Elias had shouted, his voice cracking. They'll freeze out there when the sun goes down. The temperature drops 40 degrees in the dunes. Sterling had looked at him then, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. You're young, Elias. You think with your heart, but a leader thinks with a calculator. We put it to a vote. Security or charity? The vote had been 12-1 on the council. In the crowd, the silence had been the answer. Nobody wanted to be the first to disagree with the man who controlled the oxygen valves. Elias had walked away from that crowd, but the memory of the woman's eyes as the town gates slid shut had stayed with him. He had gone to his workshop, fueled by a frantic, jagged anger. He had packed a crate of supplies, bread, water, thermal blankets, and climbed the perimeter fence. He had found them 5 kilometers into the dunes. They weren't moving. The desert night had already claimed the youngest child. The mother was huddling over the survivor, her own body crystalline with frost. She didn't thank him when he gave her the water. She just looked at him with a profound, terrifying pity. You're going to lose everything for this, she had whispered, and it won't even save us. She was right. 3 nights later, the smoke had woken him. Not the sweet smell of the forge, but the acrid stench of burning synthetic wood and ancient grease. They hadn't used a vote this time. They had used a gallon of high-grade accelerant and a single match. As his workshop collapsed into a pile of glowing ash, Elias had stood in the street. His neighbors were there, their faces illuminated by the flames of his livelihood. They didn't shout. They didn't throw stones, they just turned their backs. The baker's wife, a woman who had given Elias extra rolls every Tuesday since he was a boy, walked past him and spat on the ground. Orc lover, she had hissed, not a shout, a statement of fact. From that moment on, Elias Vance was a ghost in his own home. He was invisible. He was an expired asset. He had stayed for another month trying to rebuild, but the silence was more corrosive than the fire. He had left on a Tuesday with nothing but a pulse rifle and a pack of tools. Nobody had marked the day. Elias blinked, the frost of Boreas-Seven biting into his skin once more. He looked back at Kira. The mining laser was still steady. "I remember Ethelgard," Elias said, his voice low. "I remember why I left. I didn't come to this mountain to hunt you, Kira. I came here so I wouldn't have to look at the people who do." Kira's jaw tightened. The laser didn't waver, but the girl behind her, Jax, let out a sharp, pained groan. She slumped against the older woman, her breathing a series of short, wet gasps. "She's redlining," Kira said, her voice finally breaking. "Her internal dampeners are fried. If she doesn't get a coolant flush in the next 10 minutes, her core is going to slag." Elias stepped toward his workbench, moving slowly so as not to trigger Kira's reflexes. "I have a medical-grade centrifuge and 6 liters of synthetic coolant. I'm a gearhead, not a surgeon, but a Vanguard arm is just a hydraulic system with a nervous habit. Bring her here." Kira hesitated for 2 heartbeats, her golden eye scanning Elias for any hint of a double cross. Then she nodded. "If you zero her, Vance," she whispered, "I'll make sure you're the last thing that burns on this moon." "Fair enough," Elias replied. "Now get her on the table." We're burning daylight, and the ion storm is already scratching at the shutters. He reached for a pair of sterilized pliers and a diagnostic cable. The guilt of Ethelgard was a heavy ghost, but for the first time in 20 years, Elias felt like he was holding a torch against the dark. The cabin groaned as the first wave of the ion storm slammed into the caldera. Outside, the atmosphere was a chaotic swirl of purple lightning and abrasive dust, but inside, the air was thick with the smell of scorched copper and antiseptic. Elias worked with a frantic, focused precision. Jax was laid out on his workbench, her tattered sleeve cut away to reveal the intricate nightmare of her cybernetic arm. It was a military-grade prosthesis designed for heavy lifting and combat, but it had been maintained with nothing but spit and desperation. The primary joint was leaking a luminous, neon blue fluid that hissed as it touched the cold metal of the table. "Hold her down," Elias commanded. "The neural link is going to fight the override. She's going to kick." Kira stood at the head of the table, her powerful hands gripping Jax's shoulders. Eon had retreated to the corner with Hestia, the old woman wrapping her thin gray arms around the boy. "You okay, kid?" Kira asked, her eyes never leaving Jax's face. "Hungry," Eon whispered from the shadows. "The man has more stew." "Focus on the juice, Sarge," Jax wheezed, her eyes rolling back in her head. "Don't let this gearhead scrap me." "Zip it, Jax," Kira growled, though her touch was surprisingly tender. "Vance knows what he's doing, or he's dead. It's a win-win." Elias didn't smile. He had the diagnostic cable plugged into a port behind Jax's ear. The holographic readout was a sea of red warning icons. "She's running 105 degrees. Her heat sink is clogged with silicate dust. I have to purge the line manually." He grabbed a pressurized canister of cleaning solvent and a thin, flexible tube. "This is going to feel like someone is pouring liquid nitrogen into your marrow, Jax. Don't bite your tongue off." "I've had worse. From union recruiters," Jax managed to choke out. Elias triggered the purge. Jax's body arched off the table, a raw, mechanical scream tearing from her throat. The cybernetic arm bucked and whirled, the servos whining in protest as the solvent forced the gunk out of the delicate microvalves. Kira strained to keep her sister pinned, her own muscles bulging under her slate-gray skin. "Steady!" Elias shouted over the sound of the storm outside. I'm through the primary block. Switching to coolant. Give me the blue canister. Third shelf on the right. Kira didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on her sister's agony. Kira, the canister, now! The command snapped her out of her trance. She reached back, grabbed the titanium cylinder, and slammed it into Elias's outstretched hand. He locked it into the intake valve and initiated the flush. Slowly, the violent shivering in Jax's limbs began to subside. The glowing red heat map on the display faded to a dull, healthy amber. Jax's head fell back against the table, her breath evening out into a ragged, exhausted rhythm. Elias stepped back, wiping a smear of neon blue coolant from his forehead with the back of his hand. He felt like he had just run 10 kilometers through high gravity. His heart was a frantic drum in his ears. She's stable, Elias said, his voice shaky. The arm is on standby mode. It won't have full torque for a few days, but it won't explode. Kira released her grip on her sister. She looked at Elias, her expression a complex map of relief and lingering suspicion. You're a decent wrench, Vance. I've seen union medics with more credits and less skill screw that up. I've had a lot of time to read manuals, Elias replied. He turned toward the airlock where the wind was whistling through the gaps in the broken frame. We need to secure that door. The ion charge is building. If a bolt finds a path through that opening, the cabin's electronics will be toasted. He grabbed a heavy, lead-lined hide and a nail gun. Kira stepped in beside him, her strength far superior to his own. She held the heavy material against the frame while he fired the fasteners. Why are the hunters after you? Elias asked, not looking at her. Usually they don't bother with Scrapper 4 models. Not enough bounty on the head to justify the fuel for the trip. Kira was silent for a long time. The only sound was the thud of the nail gun and the scream of the storm outside. It's not me, she said finally. And it's not Jax. It's the boy. Elias stopped. He looked over his shoulder at Eon. The child was sitting on the floor, sharing a piece of dried fruit with Hestia. He looked so small, so fragile, despite the gray skin and the mechanical eye. What could a 6-year-old Vanguard have that's worth a deep space hunt? He's a Protocol 9 carrier, Kira whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The Union was working on a way to transmit tactical data through biological neural networks before they went under. Eon was part of the final batch. His cybernetic eye, it's not just an optic, it's a hard drive, a encrypted one. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. What's on it? We don't know, Kira said. Hestia thinks it's coordinates, a map to the Union's central archives. If the hunters get him, they won't just take the data. They'll have to harvest the neural tissue to decrypt it. They won't leave enough of him to fill a sample jar. Elias looked at the boy again. Eon was watching them, his golden eye reflecting the amber light of the cabin. He didn't look like a tactical database. He looked like a kid who was tired of being cold. They're ghosting us, Vance, Kira continued. We've been moving for 3 months. Every time we think we've lost them, they reappear. Hestia can feel their pings in the air, but she can't block them all. I can, Elias said. Kira looked at him, her eyes narrowing. How? I'm an atmospheric engineer, Elias said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. I spent 10 years building shields against solar flares. I have a portable Faraday cage in the cellar. If we put the boy in there during the transition cycles, their sensors will hit a brick wall. And what do you want in return? Kira asked, her hand drifting toward the knife at her belt. Nobody helps for free, not on Boreas-Seven. Elias looked at the broken door, then at the girl on his table, then at the boy in the corner. He thought about Ethelgard. He thought about the 22 years he had spent hiding from the ghost of a woman on a trade road. I want to stop being invisible, Elias said, and I want to see a Vanguard kid reach his 7th birthday. That's the price. Take it or leave it. Kira studied him for a long minute. The hostility in her eyes didn't vanish, but it shifted, becoming something else. A grudging, tactical respect. We stay until the storm clears, she said. Then we see about this cage of yours. Fine, Elias said. But you're cooking dinner. I'm tired of my own seasoning. As the ion storm raged outside, turning the mountain into a violet hellscape, the cabin of Elias Vance became a sanctuary of unlikely shadows. 5 people separated by species, history, and 1,000 prejudices sat in the amber light of a single stove. They ate in silence, the clink of spoons against bowls the only music. It wasn't a family, not yet. It was a collection of broken parts, scattered by a universe that saw them as expendable. But as Elias watched Eon fall asleep with his head in Hestia's lap, he realized that the trap he had set with a few protein strips had caught something far more dangerous than a thief. It had caught a reason to fight. The night deepened, the temperature outside dropping to 70 degrees below zero. But inside the cabin, the air was warm, and for the first time in 3 years, Elias Vance didn't feel the cold. "Vance," Kira said from the shadows of the corner, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. "Yeah? Don't get used to the company. We're still ghosts." "Maybe," Elias replied, closing his eyes. "But even ghosts need a place to haunt." The storm roared on, a symphony of destruction that couldn't touch the small, stubborn light burning in the caldera of Boreas-Seven. In the darkness, the seeds of a choice were beginning to take root, a choice that would eventually lead them to a stand that would shake the very foundations of the Riftward territories. Elias drifted into a light sleep, his hand resting on the hilt of his pulse rifle. In his dreams, the woman on the trade road wasn't crying anymore. She was sitting by a stove, watching a boy carve a house out of a scrap of wood, and the house had 5 plates on the table. The dawn was still 5 hours away, but on the frozen moon of Boreas-Seven, the long winter was finally beginning to break. The morning after the ion storm did not bring the sun, but a heavy, oppressive gray that felt thick enough to touch. On Boreas-Seven, the atmosphere didn't just clear, it settled, leaving behind a fine layer of purple dust that tasted like copper and old batteries. Inside the cabin, the air was warmer than it had been in 3 years, but the atmosphere was far more volatile. Elias Vance woke on the floor beside his workbench. He had given his cot to Jax, whose cybernetic arm was now wrapped in clean thermal bandages. His back ached with the dull, thrumming pain of 42 years spent in high-gravity environments, but he didn't complain. He watched the shadows of his guests in the dim light of the emergency lanterns. Kira was awake, sitting by the broken airlock door. She had spent the night staring into the gray void outside, her mining laser resting across her knees. She looked like a statue carved from industrial slag, immovable, silent, and dangerous. In the corner, Eon was curled into a ball beneath a pile of Elias's spare winter coats, his small, rhythmic snoring the only peaceful sound in the room. "You're staring, Vance," Kira said without turning her head. "I'm calculating the oxygen scrub," Elias replied, his voice gravelly from sleep. 5 bodies consume 3 times the recycled air I'm used to. We're going to need to vent the secondary tanks by noon." Kira finally turned to look at him. Her golden eye was weary, the light in it dimmed by a decade of looking for exits. "How long until the pass is clear enough for a rover?" "The drift outside is 5 meters deep," Elias said, standing up and stretching until his spine gave a series of audible pops. "Unless you want to walk into a frozen grave, we're grounded for at least 2 days, maybe 3. The ion charge in the soil needs time to dissipate, or your biomesh suits will turn into electric chairs the moment you step outside." Kira's jaw tightened. "We don't have 3 days. The hunters, the ones we call the vultures, have long-range heat seekers. They'll pick up the cabin's thermal signature eventually." "Not if I drop the output," Elias said. He walked over to the stove and began prepping a pot of synthetic oats. "We'll live in the cold for a bit. It's better than being a glowing target." Jack stirred on the cot, letting out a low, colorful string of military slang that made Kira's mouth twitch into something resembling a smile. "Damn, Sarge," Jax wheezed, her voice thin but sharp. "I feel like a rusted-out freighter that just limped through a gas giant. Tell me this gearhead didn't zero my arm." "I didn't zero it," Elias said, stepping over to the cot. "I flushed the lines and recalibrated the torque sensors. You were redlining, Jax." "Another hour and your primary joint would have turned into a localized supernova." Jax sat up slowly, her good hand supporting the cybernetic one. She flexed her fingers, the hum of the servos sounding much smoother than it had the night before. "Not bad, Vance. You got some serious skill for a civilian. Most humans see a Vanguard arm and think they can fix it with a hammer and a prayer." "I'm an engineer," Elias said. The physics of a hydraulic actuator don't change just because the skin is gray. You're lucky I had that grade 4 synthetic coolant. Most people out here use engine oil, which is a one-way ticket to a limb rot. Yeah, well, Jax muttered, looking around the cabin. Thanks for the save. I owe you one. Don't get used to it. Elias nodded. He understood the language of debt. In the Rift Word territories, thank you was a luxury, but I owe you was a contract. As the morning wore on, the cabin took on a strange domestic rhythm. Hestia, the blind elder, moved through the space with an uncanny grace, her fingers trailing along the walls as if she were reading the history of the wood. She found the stove and began to assist Kira with the meal, her senses seemingly immune to the lack of light. "The boy's awake," Hestia said, though Eon hadn't made a sound. Sure enough, a few seconds later, Eon peeked out from beneath the pile of coats. He looked at Elias, then at his mother, then at the pot on the stove. His golden eye was less frantic today, replaced by a deep, searching curiosity. "Hungry," the boy whispered. "Sit," Kira commanded, her voice softening. "Elias is making oats." Eon sat at the small table, his feet dangling a dozen centimeters above the floor. He watched Elias with the intense focus of a trainee observing a master. When Elias handed him a bowl, the boy didn't dive in like he had the night before. He waited until everyone else had been served, his eyes darting to Hestia to see how she held her spoon. "He's learning your patterns, Vance," Hestia said, her sightless eyes turned toward Elias. "He thinks you are the alpha of this burrow. He is deciding if your rules are worth keeping." "I don't have many rules," Elias said. "Stay warm. Keep the air clean. Don't break my tools, that's about it." "A simple world," Hestia murmured. "I remember a time when the Union had 1,000 rules for us. Rule number 1, you are not a person. Rule number 2, you are a unit of labor. Rule number 3, silence is your primary function." Kira's spoon clattered against her bowl. "Those rules died with the Union, Hestia. We don't talk about them anymore." "We must talk about them, Kira," Hestia said gently. "If we forget the chains, we won't recognize the freedom when it finally arrives." Elias Vance is the first human this boy has seen who didn't come with a branding iron or a cage. That is a rule being broken. The conversation drifted into an uneasy silence. Elias felt the weight of their gaze, not just Kira's suspicion or Jax's professional appraisal, but the profound, terrifying hope of a child who was looking for a reason to trust the world. After breakfast, Elias led Kira down into the cellar. It was a cramped space carved directly into the basalt of the mountain and reinforced with lead-shielded panels. In the center sat a large copper-lined crate that looked like a deep-sea diving bell. "This is the Faraday cage," Elias said. "It's built for sensitive calibration equipment, but it's large enough for the kid and a few blankets. If the vultures send a high-frequency ping, this will swallow the signal whole." Kira ran her hand over the copper mesh. "It looks like a prison, Vance." "It's a shield," Elias corrected. "On Boreas-Seven, they're often the same thing." "Look, Kira, I'm not saying he has to live in here, but when the sky clears and the ion interference drops, his eye is going to start broadcasting. If we don't muffle it, the hunters will be at the airlock before the suns are up." Kira looked at the cage, then at Elias. "Why are you doing this? You've given us food. You fixed Jax. You could have just sent us out into the storm and been done with it. You're risking a lot of marks in your own skin for a group of expired assets." Elias leaned against the damp basalt wall. He thought about Ethelgard. He thought about the 22 years he had spent as a ghost, drifting from one mining station to another, never letting anyone get close enough to see the scars on his soul. "I spent 20 years thinking that if I just kept my head down and my mouth shut, the world would leave me alone," Elias said. "I thought being a hermit was the same as being free, but all I was doing was waiting to die in a warm room." He looked Kira directly in her golden eye. "I'm tired of waiting, Kira, and I'm tired of seeing good people get treated like equipment. If that makes me a fool, then I'm a fool. But I'm a fool who knows how to build a shield." Kira didn't say anything for a long time. The tension in her shoulders didn't vanish, but it shifted. She reached out and touched Elias's arm, a brief clinical contact that felt like a bridge being built over a canyon. "We stay," she said, "but if I see a single transmitter in this cellar, Vance, the shield won't save you." "Fair enough," Elias said. "Now let's get the boy down here. We need to see how much of that Protocol 9 signal we can dampen before the hunters close the gap. The humanistic test had begun. Elias had offered his sanctuary, his secrets, and his safety. He had chosen to see the Vanguard not as a threat or a burden, but as a family in need of a home. But on Boreas-Seven, choices had a way of being measured in blood, and the cost of this particular choice was about to arrive on the wind. The 3 days following the storm were a slow-motion collision of worlds. Inside the cabin, the 5 of them existed in a delicate state of armed neutrality that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to soften into something resembling a routine. Jax was the first to break the ice. By the second day, she was bored with being an invalid. She spent her time at Elias's workbench, critiquing his organization and offering unsolicited advice on the maintenance of his pulse rifles. "You got your secondary firing pin set too tight, Vance," Jax said, disassembling the weapon with her one good hand, while her cybernetic arm provided a steadying grip. "In this cold, the metal is going to contract. You pull that trigger in a firefight, and you're going to get a click instead of a bang. That's how people get KIA in the rift." "I like a hair trigger," Elias grumbled, though he was watching her work with a fascinated professional eye. "A hair trigger is for snipers in the core systems," Jax countered. "Out here, you want reliability. You want a weapon that'll fire even if it's covered in 5 centimeters of ice in silicate grit. Give me the 3mm wrench." Elias handed it to her. "You've seen a lot of combat, Jax?" Jax's expression went flat. 5 years in the Vanguard auxiliaries. We were the first ones in and the last ones out of every shithole mining colony from here to the inner rim. We did the jobs the regular Marines were too civilized for. Clearing out tunnels, boarding derelict stations, the works. She looked at her cybernetic arm. "I lost this in a boarding action near Sector 7G. We were supposed to be securing a data vault. Turned out the vault was rigged with a fusion cell. I was the lucky one. The rest of my squad ended up as fine mist." Elias was quiet for a moment. He reached out and touched the plating of the arm. "Is that why you're with Kira?" "Kira was my sergeant," Jax said. "When the Union went belly up and the liquidation orders came down, she didn't bug out. She gathered up as many of us as she could find and headed for the fringe. She's the reason I'm still breathing, Vance. She's the reason any of us are." While Jax and Elias bonded over the brutal mechanics of survival, Hestia and Eon spent their time in the cellar. The older woman was teaching the boy how to use his heightened Vanguard senses to compensate for his broken eye. Elias would often find them sitting in the dark, their eyes closed. "What do you hear, Eon?" Hestia would whisper. "The mountain," the boy would reply, his voice small but certain. "It's a..." Groaning. "The ice is moving in the crack above the roof." "Good," Hestia said. "And what do you smell?" "Copper, oil, and... the man. He smells like old smoke and salt. That is the scent of a human who has lived alone too long," Hestia said, a faint smile on her gray lips. "Salt is the remnant of tears and sweat. It is the signature of a life that has endured." Eon opened his golden eye and looked at Elias, who was standing at the top of the stairs. "Does the salt go away?" Elias felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest. He walked down the stairs and knelt beside the boy. "No, Eon, the salt doesn't go away, but it gets easier to carry when you're not the only one holding the bag." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, carved wooden gear he had made during the night. He handed it to the boy. "What's this?" Eon asked, turning the object over in his hands. "It's a fidget," Elias said. "My father used to make them for me when I was your age. It doesn't do anything, really. It just spins. Helps you think when the world gets too loud." Eon spun the gear. A look of pure, unadulterated wonder spread across his face. The first time Elias had seen the boy look like anything other than a soldier in training. It feels smooth," Eon said. "That's the wood," Elias said. "It's from a tree that lived on Earth, thousands of years ago. My grandfather brought a sample with him when he emigrated. It's the only piece I have left." Kira appeared at the top of the stairs, her presence a silent, watchful weight. She looked at her son playing with the wooden toy, then at Elias. For the first time, there was no hostility in her gaze, only a profound, heartbreaking exhaustion. But the peace was not meant to last. On the 4th morning, the sky finally broke. The gray clouds retreated, revealing the twin suns of Boreas-Seven, two cold, white diamonds that cast long, jagged shadows across the caldera. The temperature didn't rise, but the ion interference vanished almost instantly. Elias was at the kitchen counter, prepping the midday meal, when Hestia suddenly stood up. Her sightless eyes were wide, her nostrils flared as if she were catching a scent on a wind that didn't exist. "They are here," Hestia whispered. The air in the cabin went cold. Kira was across the room in a heartbeat, her mining laser already in her hand. "Sit rep, Hestia. How many?" "Two ships," Hestia said, her voice trembling. "Light skirmishers. They are circling the ridge. They have a long-range scanner, a high-frequency pulse. I can hear it in the marrow of my bones." "Eon, get in the cage!" Kira shouted. The boy scrambled toward the cellar stairs, his face pale. Elias followed him, his heart hammering against his ribs. He shoved Eon into the copper-lined crate and slammed the heavy door shut. "Stay quiet, kid," Elias whispered through the ventilation slats. "Don't make a sound until I come for you." He raced back up the stairs. Kira and Jax were already at the windows, their weapons aimed at the eastern ridge. "Vance, get your rifle," Kira barked. "They're coming in for a landing, 500 meters out." Elias grabbed his pulse rifle and checked the charge. It was at 95%. "Wait, if we fire first, they'll know we're here. We might still be a ghost signal." "They're not here for a tea party, gearhead," Jax snapped, her cybernetic arm humming as it powered up to full torque. "They're vultures. They kill everything that moves and scrap the rest for parts." A high-pitched electronic whine filled the air, a sound like 1,000 needles scratching against glass. It was the scan. Elias watched his holographic display as the amber lines turned into a frantic, pulsing red. "The shield is holding," Elias said, his voice tight. "They're not picking up the Protocol 9 signal, but they found the cabin's thermal signature. They think we're just a lone squatter." "Then let's give them a reason to leave," Kira said, her finger hovering over the laser's trigger. A loud, amplified voice boomed across the caldera, echoing off the basalt cliffs. "Attention, unidentified squatter. This is the retrieval squad for the Synaptic Union. You are harboring stolen corporate property. Power down your shields and exit the structure with your hands visible. We are authorized to use lethal force on all expired assets and their collaborators." Elias felt a cold sweat prickling his skin. He looked at Kira. Her golden eye was fixed on the ridge, her face a mask of cold, professional resolve. "What's the play, Sarge?" Jax asked. "We don't come out," Kira said. "Vance, you have any perimeter defenses?" "Two seismic mines buried near the approach," Elias said, "and a localized EMP burst I built for the silicate trees. It'll knock out their optics for 30 seconds if they get within 50 meters. "Use them," Kira commanded. "Jax, you take the left flank. I've got the right. Vance, you stay in the center. If they breach the airlock, we give them everything we've got." "Wait," Elias said. "Look at the ships. Those aren't Union markings." He squinted at the scanners. The two skirmishers were painted a matte black, with a jagged red and white crest on the hull. A broken gear surrounded by a circle of thorns. Kira's breath hitched. The Iron Circle. They're not just hunters. They're mercenaries. The kind that don't take prisoners. "And they have a ground team," Jax added, pointing to the ridge. 4 figures emerged from the silicate forest, clad in heavy environmental combat suits. They moved with a practiced military efficiency that made the settlers of Ethelgard look like children playing with sticks. But it was the leader that caught Elias's attention. The man was tall, his suit adorned with a dozen trophy scalps from different species. He wasn't carrying a standard rifle. He had a massive two-handed energy axe that crackled with orange lightning. He stopped at the edge of the caldera and looked directly at the cabin. "Vance!" "Awarum," the leader shouted, his voice a distorted rasp through his external speakers. "I know you're in there, Elias. I remember that workshop in Ethelgard. I remember how easy it was to light that first match." Elias felt his blood turn to ice. He knew that voice. "Miller," Elias whispered. Miller had been the blacksmith in Ethelgard. He had been the one who had led the mob to Elias's door. He had been the one who had called Elias an orc lover while his life's work burned to the ground. "The world is a small place, isn't it?" Miller shouted, his laughter a cruel, mechanical sound. 22 years I've been looking for you, Elias. Ever since you cost me my bonus for that Vanguard family. Now I've got a contract that'll pay for a whole new life on the Inner Rim. Just give me the boy, and I'll let you die quick." Kira looked at Elias, her eyes wide with shock and a sudden, renewed suspicion. "You know him? You're part of this?" "No," Elias shouted, his grip tightening on his rifle. "He was the one who burned my home. He's the reason I'm here." "Then we've both got ghosts to bury," Kira said, her voice cold as the ice outside. The turning point had arrived. The past had caught up with the present, and the choice Elias had made, to protect a child and embrace a family of strangers, was about to be tested in the most brutal way possible. Miller wasn't just a hunter. He was a manifestation of the prejudice and hatred that had defined Elias's life. "They're moving," Jax yelled. The Iron Circle mercenaries began their descent, their weapons hot. "Vance," Kira said, her hand resting on his shoulder for a brief, heavy second. "Don't miss." "I won't," Elias said. He triggered the seismic mines. The ground beneath the caldera erupted in a geyser of basalt and ice. The shock wave threw the mercenaries back, but Miller stayed upright, his energy axe carving a path through the debris. "Is that all you've got, Elias?" Miller roared, his voice filled with a terrifying, ecstatic rage. "I'm going to burn this cabin down with you inside, and then I'm going to take that boy and sell his brain to the highest bidder." Elias looked at the cellar door. He thought of Eon, huddling in the dark, spinning his wooden gear and hoping for a world that didn't want to scrap him. He raised his rifle. "Not today, Miller," he whispered. "Not today." The battle for Boreas-Seven had begun, and the price of a choice was finally being paid in full. The first shockwave from the seismic mines didn't just rattle the cabin, it sang through the basalt foundations, a deep, resonant hum that Elias felt in his teeth. Outside, the purple dust of Boreas-Seven erupted into a chaotic curtain, momentarily blinding the optics of the approaching Iron Circle mercenaries. Miller's laughter, amplified through his suit's external speakers, was a jagged, ugly sound that cut through the roar of the settling debris. "Still playing with dirt and fuses, Elias? You were always better at tinkering than fighting. But this isn't Ethelgard. There's no town council to hide behind now." Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. His heart was a frantic bird trapped in his rib cage. He adjusted the setting on his pulse rifle, his fingers trembling just enough to make the metal click. He looked at Kira. She was a shadow against the frost-rimed window, her mining laser steady as a rock. "They're flanking," Kira said, her voice a low, dangerous vibration. "Two on the left, moving through the silicate grove. Jax, you see them?" "Got 'em, Sarge," Jax rasped. She was perched on a crate near the secondary viewport, her cybernetic arm humming with a predatory energy. "I'll give 'em a warm welcome. Just say the word." "Wait," Elias whispered. "The silicate trees, they're highly conductive. If I trigger the EMP burst now, the ion charge will jump from branch to branch. It'll create a localized lightning field. It won't kill them, but it'll fry their HUDs and stall their suit servos for at least 20 seconds. Kira glanced at him, her golden eye gleaming in the dim amber light of the cabin. 20 seconds is an eternity in a firefight, Vance. Do it." Elias reached for a small jury-rigged remote on his belt. He had spent months building this system to protect his cabin from the natural ion surges of the moon, never imagining he would use it as a weapon of war. He pressed the activator. The world outside turned a brilliant, searing white. A massive discharge of blue-white energy leapt from the cabin's roof, striking the nearest silicate tree. Like a circuit being closed, the lightning raced through the forest, jumping from one crystalline trunk to the next. The mercenaries in the grove were suddenly caught in a web of crackling electricity. Elias watched on his external monitors as their suits locked up, the servos whining in protest. One of the men fell forward, his environmental armor becoming a heavy, immobile coffin. "Now!" Kira barked. She and Jax opened fire. The mining laser carved a searing line of red light through the air, striking the leader of the left-hand flank. The man's shields flared once, a brilliant violet, before collapsing. The second shot took him in the chest, and he crumpled into the purple dust. Jax's pulse pistol added a staccato rhythm to the chaos, pinning the other mercenary behind a basalt outcrop. But Miller was still moving. His suit was a heavy, specialized model, designed for deep trench mining and extreme radiation. The lightning field danced across his plating, but failed to penetrate his hardened internal systems. He didn't run. He marched, his massive energy axe crackling with an orange, malevolent light. "Is that it?" Miller roared, swinging the axe in a wide arc. The blade struck a silicate tree, shattering it into 1,000 razor-sharp shards. "I've survived solar flares bigger than that spark plug. I'm coming for you, Elias. I'm gonna peel this cabin open like a tin of expired rations." He reached the airlock. The heavy Durasteel door, already weakened by Kira's initial entry, groaned as Miller slammed his shoulder into it. The sound was like a thunderclap inside the small room. "Elias!" Eon's voice drifted up from the cellar, thin and terrified. "Stay down, kid!" Elias screamed. He turned his rifle toward the door just as the latches finally gave way. The airlock didn't slide open. It exploded inward, a twisted hunk of metal flying across the room and smashing into the kitchen counter. Miller stepped through the breach, his silhouette blocking out the cold diamonds of the twin suns. He looked like a monster from a pre-expansion myth, a giant of iron and malice. The trophies on his suit, the bits of hair, the fragments of Vanguard armor, clattered together in the wind. "Found you," Miller whispered, the sound a distorted growl. Kira fired her laser, but Miller swung the energy axe, the orange blade catching the red beam and refracting it into the ceiling. The cabin's overhead lights shattered, plunging the room into a chaotic strobe light of emergency flares. "Jax, move!" Kira shouted. Jax lunged forward, her cybernetic arm reaching for Miller's throat, but the mercenary was too fast. He caught her by the wrist, the servos in his suit groaning as he squeezed. Jax let out a cry of pain as the metal of her arm began to buckle. "You're a high-grade model," Miller said, looking at Jax. "I might keep you for parts, but the boy, he's the real prize." Elias didn't think. He didn't calculate the odds or the torque of his joints. He didn't act like a man who had been hiding for 22 years. He acted like a man who had finally decided that some things were worth the fire. He lunged at Miller, not with his rifle, but with a heavy industrial soldering iron he had grabbed from the workbench. He jammed the white-hot tip into the exposed cooling vent on Miller's shoulder. Miller roared, a sound of pure mechanical agony. The coolant in his suit began to hiss and spray, a thick white mist filling the room. He released Jax, who stumbled back into Kira's arms. "You little worm!" Miller screamed, swinging the energy axe at Elias. Elias ducked, the orange blade whistling centimeters above his head and carving a glowing furrow into the wall. He rolled toward the cellar stairs, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. "Kira, get Hestia and Jax to the back," Elias shouted. "The cellar, it's the only place with reinforced shielding." "We aren't running, Vance," Kira yelled, her face smeared with soot and blood. "It's not running," Elias countered, firing a burst from his rifle to keep Miller back. "The storm is coming back. I can feel the static. If we stay up here, the next lightning strike will kill us all." He saw the hesitation in Kira's eyes. She looked at her sister, who was clutching her mangled cybernetic arm, and then at Hestia, who was standing in the center of the chaos, her sightless eyes calm and terrible. "Fine," Kira spat. "Into the hole." They scrambled down the stairs, Elias being the last to leave the main floor. As he descended, he saw Miller recovering, the mercenary suit venting steam like a wounded dragon. Miller turned his gaze toward the cellar, his orange axe glowing brighter than ever. "There's nowhere left to go, Elias," Miller shouted, his voice echoing down the stairwell. "You've run out of moon." Elias slammed the heavy, lead-shielded trapdoor and bolted it. He stood in the dark, breathing the stale, iron-scented air of the cellar. Beside him, Eon was huddled in the Faraday cage, his small hands gripping the copper mesh. The humanistic theme had moved from subtext to the very heart of the struggle. Elias Vance was no longer a man protecting a secret. He was a man protecting a family. And as the sound of Miller's axe began to thud against the trapdoor above them, Elias realized that the most dangerous thing in the universe wasn't a mercenary with an energy axe. It was a man who finally had something to lose. The darkness of the cellar was absolute, save for the rhythmic amber flicker of the emergency power cell and the neon blue sparks dancing from Jax's damaged arm. Above them, the sound of Miller's axe was a rhythmic, soul-crushing percussion. Thump, thump, Thump! Each blow sent a shower of dust and stone chips falling from the basalt ceiling. "He's gonna breach," Jax whispered, her voice tight with pain. "That axe is rated for hull plating. This door won't hold 5 minutes." Kira was at the base of the stairs, her mining laser aimed at the trap door. She looked like a predator backed into a corner, dangerous, desperate, and beautiful. "Let him come. I've still got 2 charges in this cell. I'll burn his head off the moment he sticks it through." "No," Hestia said. The old woman was sitting on a crate, her hand resting on the copper cage where Eon was hidden. Her voice was calm, a sharp contrast to the violence above. "Hestia, not now with the Zen talk," Jax snapped. "We're about to get slagged." "Listen," Hestia commanded. They all froze. Beneath the sound of the axe, there was another noise, a high-pitched, warbling whine that seemed to be coming from inside the room. It was a digital sound, a frantic chirping that carried a sense of urgent, coded information. Elias turned toward the cage. "Eon." The boy was shivering, his small body vibrating with an intensity that made the copper mesh rattle. But it was his cybernetic eye that drew their attention. The shattered glass and flickering fiber optics were no longer dim. They were glowing with a brilliant, pulsing white light, a beacon in the dark. "Protocol 9, Kira whispered, her face going pale. "It's activating." "The stress," Elias said, stepping toward the cage. "The physical trauma of the fight and the proximity to the mercenaries' high-frequency sensors. It's triggered the broadcast." "Eon, kid, can you hear me?" The boy didn't answer. His golden eye was rolled back in his head, showing only the white. He was murmuring something, a string of letters and numbers that flowed from his lips like water. "Sector 749, Alpha 902, Marcus Vane, Sarah Thorne, Kalen Hess." "Names," Hestia whispered, her voice filled with awe. "He's reading names." "What is it, Vance?" Kira asked, her voice trembling. "What is he doing?" Elias knelt beside the cage, his engineering mind racing to process the data. He looked at the flickering light in Eon's eye. "It's not a map to an archive, Kira. Eon is the archive. Protocol 9, it was the Union's final failsafe. It's a registry. Every Vanguard ever manufactured, their current location, their biological status, and their neural encryption keys." The realization hit them like a physical blow. Eon wasn't just a child, he was the ledger of a race. He held the identities and locations of thousands of Vanguards who had managed to slip away into the fringe, living as ghosts and scrappers. "If Miller gets him," Elias said, his voice cold, "he doesn't just get a payday, he gets a hit list. He gets the coordinates of every free Vanguard in the Riftward territories. They'll hunt you all to extinction in a month." Crack! The trapdoor above them buckled. A sliver of orange light sliced through the darkness as Miller's energy axe finally breached the reinforced metal. "Elias!" Miller roared, his voice muffled but triumphant. "I can see the signal." "The boy's glowing like a goddamn sun. You can't hide that kind of value in a cellar." Kira turned her laser toward the breach, but Elias grabbed her arm. "Wait," Elias said. "If you fire now, the atmospheric pressure change will cause a flashback. The cellar is full of vented oxygen and synthetic coolant fumes. You'll blow us all to hell." "Then what do we do, Vance?" Kira hissed. "We sit here and wait for him to chop us into pieces?" Elias looked at Eon. The boy was still chanting, his small voice a haunting litany of the lost. He looked at Jax, who was holding her mangled arm, and at Hestia, who was watching a world only she could see. Finally, he looked at Kira. The humanistic theme crystallized in that moment. Elias Vance had spent 22 years running from the fire, thinking that survival was the only thing that mattered. But survival without purpose was just a slow death. He had found a family in this frozen hollow, a circle of people who had chosen him as much as he had chosen them. "The Faraday cage," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "It's not just for shielding, it's a capacitor. If I reverse the polarity on the copper mesh and hook it up to the cabin's main power cell, I can turn the whole cage into a directional EMP projector." "And what happens to the kid?" Kira asked, her hand tightening on her laser. "He'll be safe," Elias said. "The mesh is designed to push the energy outward, but someone has to stay outside the cage to trigger the manual override, and that someone is going to be in the middle of the discharge." You'll fry your own nervous system, Vance, Jax said, her eyes wide. Human hearts don't handle that kind of amperage. It's not a vote this time, Jax, Elias said, a faint smile on his lips. It's an engineering solution. He turned to the wall and began frantically ripping wires from the primary power junction. He worked with a speed born of desperation, his hands moving through the familiar geography of the cabin's guts. Kyra, Elias said as he twisted two heavy copper cables together. Get in the cage with Eon. Hold him tight. Don't let go, no matter what happens. Elias, no, Kira whispered. Get in the cage, Kira, Elias roared. I spent my whole life being the guy who didn't say no. Just let me be the guy who says yes, just this once. Kira stared at him, her golden eyes swimming with an emotion she had never been allowed to feel. She saw the man behind the engineer, the boy from Ethelgard who had wanted to save the world, and the hermit who had finally found a home. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement, and climbed into the cage, pulling Eon into her arms. Jax and Hestia followed, the four of them huddling together in the cramped, copper-lined space. Bang! The trapdoor flew off its hinges, crashing into the cellar floor. Miller stepped into the breach, his energy axe illuminating the room with a hellish orange glow. He looked at Elias, who was standing by the power junction, holding two sparking cables. What are you doing, Elias? Miller laughed, his voice dripping with contempt. You gonna fix the lights before I kill you? No, Miller, Elias said. I'm gonna turn them off. Ador. Miller raised his axe, the orange blade crackling as it prepared for the final strike. Give me the boy, Vance. It's over. Elias looked at the cage. He saw Kira's eyes watching him through the mesh. He saw Eon's flickering eye. He felt the salt of his own sweat, the weight of his 42 years, and the profound, terrifying peace of a man who finally knew who he was. Family isn't just blood, Miller, Elias whispered. It's the people who stay when everyone else turns their back. He slammed the cables together. The cellar erupted in a blinding blue-white explosion. The sound wasn't a roar. It was a shriek, a high-frequency scream that shattered the silicate dust and made the basalt walls vibrate. A massive pulse of electromagnetic energy surged through the copper mesh, directed outward in a concentrated cone. Miller didn't even have time to scream. The electronics in his suit, the life support, the servos, the energy axe, didn't just stall, they detonated. The mercenary was thrown backward by the sheer force of the discharge, his armor sparking and venting black, acrid smoke as he flew up the stairwell and crashed back onto the main floor. Elias felt the world vanish into a sea of white pain. It felt like 1,000 needles were being driven into his chest. His vision blurred, his muscles seizing as the residual amperage raced through his body. He fell to his knees, his hands still gripping the cables, his breath a ragged, agonizing struggle. The silence that followed was more absolute than the cold outside. Elias slumped against the wall, his vision slowly returning in jagged, gray fragments. He looked toward the cage. The copper mesh was glowing a dull, hot red, but the four figures inside were moving. Kira pushed the door open, her face a mask of terror. She scrambled out and caught Elias before he hit the floor. Vance! Elias! Talk to me, you stupid gearhead! Elias looked up at her. He tried to speak, but his throat felt like it was full of glass. He managed a weak, fluttering cough. Is the kid okay? Eon crawled out of the cage and knelt beside him. The white light in his eye had vanished, replaced by the familiar broken flicker. The Protocol 9 broadcast had been severed by the EMP pulse. The boy reached out and touched Elias's cheek with a small gray hand. Elias, the boy whispered, you saved the names. Elias closed his eyes, a single tear cutting through the soot on his face. I saved the family, Eon. That's all that matters. Jax and Hestia emerged from the cage, their faces pale but their spirits unbroken. Jax looked up the stairwell, where the smoke from Miller's suit was drifting down in heavy black clouds. He's toast, Vance, Jax said, her voice shaky. That pulse fried his core. He won't be swinging an axe for a long, long time. Kira held Elias close, her warmth a solid, grounding presence in the freezing cellar. She didn't say thank you. She didn't offer a debt, She simply rested her forehead against his, her golden eye closing as she let out a long, shuddering breath. "You're a moth, Elias Vance," she whispered. "You flew right into the fire." "Yeah," Elias rasped, his hand finding Eon's small wooden gear in his pocket. "But the fire, it didn't burn me this time. It just lit the way." The humanistic theme had reached its climax. The hermit of Boreas-Seven had sacrificed his safety, his health, and nearly his life for a group of strangers who were no longer strangers. He had learned that the only way to overcome the ghosts of the past was to build something real in the present. Above them, the twin suns continued their cold journey across the sky, and the frozen moon continued to groan under the weight of the ice. But inside the basalt cellar, a new world was being born. A world where names were protected, where brothers and sisters were chosen, and where a man with a broken heart could finally find a place to call home. "Come on," Kira said, helping him to his feet. "We need to secure the airlock. The vultures might have friends, and we've got a long winter ahead of us." "We've got the heat trap," Eon said, gripping Elias's hand. "Yeah, kid," Elias said, his voice stronger now. "We've got the heat trap." They walked up the stairs together, a human, a warrior, a tech, an elder, and a child, a circle of five standing against the infinite cold. The air in the cellar tasted like charred insulation and the metallic tang of ionized ozone. Elias Vance lay on the cold basalt floor, his lungs working like a pair of rusted bellows. Every nerve in his body was screaming, a high-frequency vibration that made his skin feel 2 sizes too small. He could hear the faint, rhythmic clicking of the emergency power cell as it struggled to reset after the massive discharge. "Vance." Kira's voice was a ragged whisper near his ear. "Come on, gearhead. Breathe. Don't you dare go KIA on me now." Elias managed a weak, fluttering cough. His vision was slowly returning, though the edges were still frayed with static. He felt a small, cool hand press against his forehead. "He's burning up, Mama," Eon whispered. "The man is hot like the stove." "The neural dampeners," Hestia said, her voice calm and steady from the shadows. "His nervous system has taken a shock that would have zeroed a regular civilian. He needs hydration and rest. But first, we need to know if we are still being hunted." Elias tried to sit up, but the world tilted violently to the left. Kira caught him, her strong arms providing a solid, grounding presence. She smelled of smoke and slate, a scent that had once signaled danger, but now felt like a promise. "The ships," Elias rasped, his throat feeling like he had swallowed a handful of silicate grit. Did they bug out?" Jack stood at the base of the stairs, her cybernetic arms sparking and twitching. She looked up through the shattered trapdoor, her one good eye squinting at the black smoke drifting down from the main floor. "I can't hear the engines anymore, Vance. That EMP didn't just fry Miller. It must have scrambled the short-range comms for the whole caldera. If those vultures have any sense, they've pulled back to orbit to figure out what just hit them." "I didn't think it would be that loud," Elias murmured, his eyes closing again. "You didn't think?" Jax let out a short, jagged laugh. "You turned the whole cabin into a localized supernova, gearhead. I've seen orbital strikes that had less kick than that pulse. You're lucky your heart didn't just stop." Kira helped him to his feet, her golden eye watching the stairs with a predatory intensity. "We can't stay in the cellar. The smoke is getting thick. Jax, get Hestia and the boy to the secondary airlock. I'm taking Vance up to see the damage." They moved slowly, a procession of shadows climbing out of the dark. When they reached the main floor, the sight that met them was one of absolute devastation. The cabin, once a model of solitary efficiency, was a ruin. The workbench was shattered, the cabinets had been blown off their hinges, and the floor was covered in a layer of black soot. In the center of the room lay the remains of Miller. The mercenary's heavy environmental suit was fused and blackened, the energy axe lying 2 meters away, its orange blade dead and cold. Miller wasn't moving. The EMP had turned his high-tech armor into a lead coffin. Elias looked at the man who had burned his life down 22 years ago. He felt no triumph, no surge of righteous vengeance. He only felt a profound, weary sadness. Miller had spent 2 decades chasing a ghost, and in the end, he had been consumed by the very hatred he had nurtured. "He's gone," Kira said, her hand tightening on Elias's shoulder. "The debt is paid, Vance." "Yeah," Elias whispered, "but the house is broken." "We can fix a house," Jax said, stepping into the room and surveying the wreckage with a professional eye. "We've got an engineer, a tech, and enough scrap metal here to build a small freighter. We're not done yet." Hestia led Eon toward the kitchen counter, which was one of the few things still standing. The boy was looking at Miller's body with a strange, quiet expression. "Is he a ghost now?" Eon asked. "He's a lesson," Hestia said, her sightless eyes turned toward the ceiling. "A lesson in what happens when you let the fire inside you get too big to control." Elias slumped into his one remaining chair, watching as the three Vanguard women began the work of reclaiming the space. Kira was already at the airlock, using a heavy pry bar to straighten the frame. Jax was salvaging components from Miller's suit, her cybernetic arm working with a renewed, if shaky, precision. He realized then that they weren't waiting for him to tell them what to do. They were a unit, a functional system that had incorporated him into its structure. For 22 years, Elias had been the sole operator of his life, calculating every move, every calorie, every risk in a vacuum of his own making. But now the math had changed. "You okay?" Kira asked, stopping her work for a moment to look at him. "I'm thinking about the oxygen," Elias said, a faint smile touching his lips. "The oxygen?" "Yeah. 5 bodies. We're definitely going to have to vent the tanks." Kira shook her head, a soft, genuine laugh escaping her. "You're a strange man, Elias Vance. But I guess we're a strange group." The immediate aftermath of the battle was a blur of labor and low-voiced conversation. They worked through the night, fueled by synthetic protein and the adrenaline that refused to dissipate. They didn't talk about the Iron Circle or the Protocol 9 registry. They talked about the torque on the door hinges and the best way to scrub the soot from the walls. As the first white diamond of the twin suns began to peek over the ridge, Elias stood on the threshold of his broken door. The air was cold, -40 degrees Celsius, but the wind was calm. He looked out at the caldera, at the silicate trees and the purple dust, and for the first time in his life, the landscape didn't look like a prison. It looked like a foundation. He had spent his life thinking that safety was something you found by hiding. He had thought that the only way to protect himself from the fire was to stay in the dark. But as he watched Eon helping Jax organize the salvageable tools, Elias understood that the only true safety was the kind you built with other people. Secondary characters, the ghosts of his past and the strangers of his present, had become the pillars of his new world. Kira's strength, Jax's technical defiance, Hestia's wisdom, and Eon's untainted hope, they were the components of a machine that worked better than anything he could have designed alone. The transformation was beginning, and it was painful, like a bone being set or a circuit being remapped. But as Elias Vance turned back to the warmth of his ruined cabin, he knew that he wasn't a ghost anymore. He was a man with a hammer in his hand and 4 people who were counting on him to use it. 3 months had passed since the day the lightning had struck the cellar. On Boreas-Seven, 3 months was an eternity. The long, brutal winter was finally losing its grip, and the mountain was beginning to breathe again. The ice in the higher passes was cracking with the sound of distant artillery, and the first meltwater was beginning to trickle down the basalt cliffs, tasting of iron and ancient history. Elias Vance stood on the porch of the expanded cabin. It was no longer a hermit's hovel. They had spent the last 90 days stripping the Iron Circle's skirmisher, which had crashed 2 ridges over after the EMP fried its navigation, and using the hull plating to double the size of the living quarters. The cabin now had 3 separate rooms, a reinforced workshop, and a dedicated hydroponics bay that was currently yielding its first crop of nutrient-dense moss. He checked his wrist unit. It was 6 in the evening. The twin suns were dipping below the horizon, painting the caldera in shades of deep violet and bruised orange. "Eon, time to bring the solar cells in," Elias shouted. The boy appeared from behind the silicate grove, moving with a grace and confidence that had been absent 90 days ago. Eon was taller now, his slate-gray skin healthy and clear. He carried 2 heavy solar panels under each arm as if they were made of feathers, a testament to his Vanguard physiology. "Got him, Elias!" the boy shouted back. "And I found a new snip coil near the creek. Bring it to the shop. We'll look at it after dinner. Elias walked inside, the familiar hiss of the airlock, a comforting sound. The interior of the cabin was warm and bright, powered by the hybrid generator they had built from the remains of Miller's armor and the skirmisher's fusion core. Kira was at the stove, her golden eye reflecting the blue flame. She wasn't wearing her armor today. She had on a simple, grease-stained jumpsuit, her copper wire braids pulled back in a practical knot. She was seasoning a pot of stew with a blend of wild sage and thyme that Hestia had found on the western ridge. Jax was at the workbench, her cybernetic arm now fully integrated and polished to a mirror shine. She was showing Hestia how to feel the vibration of a high-frequency transmitter. "You feel that hum, Hestia?" Jax asked. "That's the pulse. If it gets faster, it means the signal is searching." "I feel it, Jax," the old woman said, her fingers dancing over the metal. "It sounds like a nervous bird." "Dinner's ready," Kira announced, her voice echoing through the expanded space. They gathered around the new table Elias had built. It was a large circular thing made from the reclaimed wood of his old workbench and reinforced with durasteel. It wasn't a table for one, it was a table for five. Elias looked at the plates, 5 of them arranged in a perfect circle. He thought back to the small, lopsided house Eon had carved in the dark of winter. The boy had known what they were before Elias had even dared to dream it. As they ate, the conversation was easy and light, filled with the mundane details of their shared life. They talked about the pressure in the moisture evaporators and the way the moss was growing in the hydroponics bay. They talked about the names Eon had recited in the cellar, the Protocol 9 registry. They had decided together to keep the information hidden, a secret held by the Circle of Five until the world was ready to hear it. After dinner, Eon retreated to his corner with the wooden gear Elias had given him, though he now had a whole box of hand-carved toys to choose from. Kira and Jax began the work of cleaning the filters, their movements synchronized and efficient. Elias sat on the step of the porch, looking out at the stars. The silence of Boreas-Seven was still there, but it was no longer a hollow thing. It was a silence that held the weight of 1,000 stories, 1,000 lives, and the promise of 1,000 more. He leaned back against the durasteel wall and closed his eyes, his mind drifting back across the long, jagged road that had led him here. 22 years ago, I thought the world was a ledger of debts and failures. I thought that by saving that family in the dunes, I had paid a price I could never recover. I spent 2 decades counting every calorie, every mark, and every breath as if I were trying to balance a scale that was permanently tipped against me. I thought that the fire had taken my home, my purpose, and my humanity, leaving nothing behind but a ghost in an engineer's parka. But standing here now, with the smell of sage in the air and the sound of a child's laughter in my ears, I realized that the fire didn't take anything. It just cleared away the dead wood. It took a long time and a lot of cold nights, but I finally understand that we aren't defined by the things we lose. We are defined by the things we choose to protect. I didn't find a family by accident. I found them by finally deciding that being safe wasn't as important as being real. Humanity isn't a species or a biometric profile. It isn't something you're born with or something that can be manufactured in a gestation tube. It's a decision. It's the choice to open a door when the wind is cold, to set a bone when the hand is shaking, and to share a bowl of stew with a stranger who has teeth that can bite. I used to be a man who fixed machines. Now I think I'm just a man who is learning how to be a person. And maybe, in a universe as vast and cold as this one, that's the only engineering project that actually matters. The twin suns had vanished completely, leaving the sky to the brilliant, uncaring stars. Elias felt a hand on his shoulder. He didn't have to look to know it was Kira. "Thinking again, Vance?" she asked, her voice a soft vibration in the cool air. "Just doing the math," Elias said, looking up at her. "And? How does it look?" Elias reached out and took her hand. It was rough, scarred, and warm. "The math looks good, Kira. For the first time in 42 years, the result is exactly where it needs to be." They sat together for a long time, watching the purple dust settle on the rocks. The hermitage was gone. The isolation was broken. In its place was an outpost, a small, stubborn light burning on the edge of the galaxy, a testament to the fact that even in the deepest freeze, the heart can find a way to grow back. I spent so many years thinking that the walls I built were what kept me alive. But looking at these four people, I have to wonder, is there someone in your own life that you've been keeping at a distance, thinking that the silence is safer than the sound of their voice? What would happen if you finally stopped counting the cost of opening the door and just let the light in? Elias Vance stood up and walked back into the cabin, closing the airlock behind him. The click of the latch was final, not because it was locking the world out, but because it was holding the home in. Inside, the 5 plates were empty, but the circle was full.